Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from, either live on July 1st or afterwards. Welcome to the 4th Oxford University Press History Book Club meeting. My name is Susan Ferber, and I'm one of the history editors at OUP. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. For those of you who were at the previous book club meetings featuring Thomas Holt's The Movement, Kevin Weddell's The Complete Victory, or Anneliese Heinz's Mahjong, welcome back. If you didn't see those live, you can watch the recordings on OUP's YouTube channel. For those of you who are joining for the first time, here's a little background on the book club. Reading and talking about books in a group has a long tradition. In the 18th and 19th century, the first secular American reading circles, or conversations, a precursor to book clubs, were begun by women. They required little more than a thirst for literature and a desire to discuss it with like-minded individuals, to talk about challenging ideas, to learn together, and hopefully to have some fun along the way. That's the spirit in which this book club was founded. While we lack an intimacy of a small group in a living room or a coffee shop, I hope we can gain in creating a broad community of readers. This book club will give you the chance to directly interact with authors, as well as an opportunity to continue the conversation online with others in the book club. Every meeting features 2 Oxford authors in conversation, in this case the writer of a new book with one of our backlist title authors. Over time, we aim to share histories from across the globe, from a variety of periods of history, and many different authorial perspectives. So let's get to the main event, since I'm sure you're all attending here because you want to learn more about camping. So tonight will be minus the tents, minus the s'mores, and minus the off. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our authors and the book today. This is the most bare bones description of these historians, since we could easily take a half hour just to talk about their accomplishments. Phoebe S.K. Young is Associate Professor of History at the University of Colorado, Boulder, who specializes in environmental history and cultural history in the West and modern United States. She's the author of California Vieja, Culture and Memory in a Modern Place. Her second book, which I had the privilege of editing, is the work we'll be talking about today, Camping Grounds, Public Nature in American Life from the Civil War to the Occupy Movement. She's joined in conversation by Andrew Kirk, Professor of History at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. He's the author of numerous books, including Counterculture Green, The Whole Earth Catalog in American Environmentalism, and more recently for OUP, the stunning graphic history, Doomtown, The People and Landscapes of Atomic Testing. Andy and Phoebe are going to speak for about 30 or 35 minutes, and then the floor will be open to your questions. Audience, you can start putting them in the chat anytime, and my colleague Erin Cox will bring up as many as she can in the second half hour. You can also go to the Twitter feed at OUP History and comment using the hashtag OUP History Book Club. So welcome, Phoebe and Andy. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. It's great to be here.
So maybe let me start just by saying congratulations on this incredibly timely book during an historic surge of camping and sleeping outdoors. You couldn't have timed that better. I know in my part of the world, in the American Southwest, it's been nearly impossible to get a campsite. Things have been overrun, and so this book resonated with me in many, many ways. I organized an annual camp trip for my department, and I called to reserve it for later in the fall and was told they were booked for a year and a half. So it is very timely. And I enjoyed reading this book more than really almost anything I've read in a long time. It resonated both with my scholarly interests, but it also taught me some things about the context for my own personal relationship with the outdoors and my life as a camper. Better than really anything I've ever read. The motives, the way those motives of people were commodified at times, it was really amazing. It's beautifully written. The research is incredible. The footnotes are worth the price of the book alone. And the history is loaded with fascinating characters and original ideas. It's an amazing accomplishment and a beautiful object. So excellent production. I thought,
Thank you, Andy, and let me just thank Susan Ferber for the tremendous work in helping make this book accessible to a wide variety of readers whose scholarly interests and personal interests, as well as the production team at Oxford. I think just did a remarkable job. So thank you all.
Yeah, and thank you, Susan, for having me. One of the things I wanted to know just immediately, reading this book is your story of how you came to this topic and your personal history with camping. I think everybody would want to know that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I grew up at camping as a small child across the Southwest in a VW Bug with no air conditioning all over the place in the 1970s. But that's not really the origins of this project per se, even though I continued to camp, especially after I had kids, taking them camping and sort of sharing the outdoors with them. But it really came a little bit later when I was in graduate school or just after, still working on my other book, and thinking a little bit more about not just how camping allows us to enjoy the outdoors, but that people have different experiences with it. They didn't all have the same kind of experience that I did growing up. And a good friend of mine, who is herself a history professor now, but went camping for the first time when she was 30, and she had a great trip to Zion National Park. And she went home and asked her father why they never camped growing up. And his answer was that they were poor when he was younger, and that he slept outside many times because he had to, or on the ground. And that now that he'd kind of made it out of that space, that when he went on vacation, he wanted a bed and a hotel, and that camping just did not seem like anything that sounded like fun or relaxing to him. And so that for me was just kind of the first inkling that there was something more to the story, to sort of taking that rock and turning it over, sort of what's underneath this thing we all take for granted, or so many of us do, of what camping means. And so it kind of unraveled from there. Of that sort of inspiration.
That's great. I had some similar experiences. Most people assume camping is all about recreation, but one of the really amazing things about this book is how you provide a much more nuanced history of the recreational type of camping, but also present it as much more complicated and much more important than I think most people might assume. Can you explain?
So it's true. I mean, the thing that immediately pops into most people's minds when you say camping is that classic recreational version, right? You know, pay the federal government $10 if you can get a reservation for a picnic table, a parking spot, and a fire ring. But as I was working on this project, and really the first few years were mostly about kind of digging into that recreational side and why some people enjoyed it and others didn't, and what are the different ways in which people camped. But then a couple of events led me to think differently about this question. So the combination of the Great Recession and the Occupy Wall Street movement really brought to the fore ways in which people might be doing very similar looking kinds of activities, pitching a tent, sleeping outside, but they're doing that for very different reasons, with different intentions, propelled by different social contexts, to have to do that for either functional needs, right, as a kind of choice of last resort, as well as an attempt to make a political point, to stake a claim to a piece of ground and get a message across. And so I started to think about these three different categories, both as very different, but also the ways in which we have come to think of them as so fundamentally different, but that their origins are not so clearly delineated, right? They're much more messy, and they still are in our own time. But to think about the ways in which these three strands emerged from what was, at least from my research, in before the middle of the 19th century, something that didn't carry a whole lot of cultural meaning. You camped when there wasn't indoor lodging, when you found yourself in between towns, and you might like it and you might not, but it didn't carry, as at least as far as I could determine, the kind of cultural meaning that it would come to by the end of the 19th century and moving forward. So kind of teasing out how we got these very different kinds of camping from similar origins, and that have a sort of evolution in concert and intention with each other. That they were never really isolated strands the whole way along.
Yeah, that's great. The kind of appropriateness of different kinds of camping. I've had the opportunity to see a lot of your work leading up to this book, and I know that you've been working for a long time as an innovator in the field of environmental history, looking at the culture-nature paradox. And I was wondering if you could talk about that paradox and what camping can tell us about American culture.
So, I mean, the question of sort of how we think about the relationship between nature and culture is an ongoing one, and I certainly don't have the answer to that. It is a paradox. It's a conundrum. It's sort of however you want to frame that. But at least from the way I think about it as an environmental historian, is that we can definitely talk, and it's important to talk about the physical material, right? The physical world, and what sort of how that manifests itself, how it's being challenged and degraded in our own time is incredibly important. But as a cultural historian, I also think that it's impossible to disentangle our understanding of what nature means from the physical material itself. That these two things are hitched together in a way that you can't really resolve which one is primary in any given situation. That this physical material is affected all the time by what we think about it and how we approach it, and vice versa, that sort of the physical world shapes how we think about who we are as humans and our relationship to nature. So that's kind of just like the basic approach that I take to that. And camping, I think, where that comes in for me is that it really is very much a social cultural practice that has evolved over time historically, that it's easy to think like, oh, camping means getting back to nature. But just kind of unpacking that phrase, like, why do we think that camping is the good platform to do that? And what is natural about that, again, expectation of having this infrastructure waiting for you in the woods, the picnic table, the fire ring, right? Those are all products of history and culture, of what people who were interested in getting to the outdoors wanted, and how they wanted to inhabit these spaces, and that in turn affected the spaces themselves, how many people went to what kinds of spaces, how they were allowed to interact with them, what sort of elements of sort of access to different landmarks people were given, what the sort of degradation that happened. So the camping suggests that there's sort of ongoing negotiation between the physical nature and the sort of cultural history in how we approach it.
That was one of the aspects of this book that I really appreciated, was I think it's one of the best versions of a cultural history of environment or environmental history of culture that I've encountered. And you do it all so subtly that you never are taken away from the narrative, which is really compelling. So I think that is a remarkable part of this book. There's a lot that has gone into these debates. You have them in there, but they never overwhelm the super interesting story. So I really liked that, really appreciated it. And I've read this book twice now, and on the second reading, I was especially struck by the first couple of chapters, the chapter on the Civil War and the chapter on the journey home. And the journey home chapter I just loved. And how I wondered how you thought these critical moments in American history represent the origin story of American camping as we know it.
Yeah, so I mean, most histories of outdoor recreation start a little bit later, although some of them with John Muir, who's the major protagonist of the second chapter, but that in that kind of late 19th century moment of sort of preservation and new sort of fad and interest in wilderness. But so the Civil War, right, is not where you normally think of the sort of origins of the history of outdoor recreation. So all these Civil War soldiers, right, men that volunteered or were conscripted into the army and camped in a very oppressive hierarchical military style. But that what I started to see was really in the aftermath of the Civil War, where veterans were reminiscing, and that the major veterans organizations, particularly for the Union veterans, engaged in camping as a form of reunion. And so their annual encampments, as they called it, all throughout the 1860s and 70s and 80s and 90s, even as the veterans were getting quite elderly, that it remained important for them to represent themselves as the boys in camp. And that what was so interesting to me about this was that it really complicated, again, these categories. So for on one level, they were engaged in a kind of lobbying movement, that this was part of their campaign to get the federal government to pay veterans pensions, right? And so to demonstrate themselves as the boys who won the war, who saved the Union, and remind them of that camp was really important in that. But that it was also, for many veterans, an enjoyable experience, not just going back in the tents, but connecting with their old comrades. And that a lot of what they were about, whether it was in those reunions or on their own private camps, was less about getting back to nature per se. That sort of nature became a platform to create a kind of intentional community. And they were very much about cultivating those social relations between each other and kind of trying to capture a bit of the camaraderie that they got in those army camps, in between the battles on the one hand and the boredom and the dysentery on the other. And so to me, it suggests that there were some earlier stirrings that had something else to do, that camping was about more than just nature per se, right? And so that's kind of the story of the Civil War veterans, and why I felt like it was useful to start with them, because from the get-go, it suggests that there's a more complex ingredients that went into producing the recreational camping that many people, still enjoy, but then also the origins of these other strands, right, of political camping in that case, particularly. So do you want to ask something more specific about John Muir? Do you want me to jump in?
That chapter really illustrated something that then follows throughout the book, that theme of sort of the love-hate with camping, or the very thin line sometimes between too much adversity and leisure, and when is enough adversity and when is too much, and people who are miserable and suffering during war, but then really quickly retool. I think when you show those transitions and those tensions, it really it makes your point about the way camping is more than just about going outdoors, and I really enjoyed that part of that chapter. And I was really compelled by the way you explain your idea of public nature, the relationship of public nature to evolving notions of the social contract at several critical moments during the chronology that you cover. And I thought that your chapter on tramp style, which is one of my favorites, really kind of, that's where that came together for me. You want to talk about public nature and the social contract?
Sure. So so those two concepts are really kind of the biggest frame for these questions, and kind of what camping, not as the only route to helping us think about what Americans believe, citizens and the government owe each other, right, in that social contract, or think about the kinds of public outdoor spaces or access to those spaces, right, in terms of public nature. And that these two concepts, I think, really helped me to see camping as more than just a fun thing that people do on their vacation, but that really taps into some of the long-standing core beliefs about the nation itself. And that it's not as if other things can't do that. I mean, I think there's a reason why camping has these different aspects, and that continue to speak to us in ways, forgive me, that things like skiing or cycling might not. They have really interesting histories. I love to ski. I dislike riding a bike intensely. But so you can like them, and they have really interesting histories, and scholars have written about them. But there's something about camping to me that speaks to us. And I think it's because it goes back to that social contract, where in the founding era, right, inspired by folks like John Locke, people like Thomas Jefferson made this argument that the U.S. should be based upon connection with the land and with agrarian citizens, and that the formula was that you mix your labor with the land, produce property, and that is the basis for being a virtuous citizen, right? And that from that, so much of early American history kind of flowed. And even as that became less and less possible pretty quickly throughout the 19th century of making a sustainable life as a small family farmer, the more people were moving to the cities, getting jobs in factories and offices and losing that connection to the land, that they still felt a kind of symbolic tie, right? That this was the core, the land was the core. And it began to shift so that people wanted to have still some connection, but now they begin to mix their leisure with the land instead of their labor. And so that sort of shifts in a kind of consumer culture world by the early 20th century becomes like the kind of prime use of these public nature spaces as for citizens to go take their leisure time and participate in the nation that way. So you see this big transformation. But I think it's also that connection to that social contract is why functional campers, so the unsheltered or tramps in the late 19th century, and political campers, whether they be Union Army veterans or Occupy Wall Street activists, that making that claim on space, that physical land, is partly what sort of brings these added elements to the practice of camping itself, and why camping can tell us about some of these large-scale shifts in how we think about our relationships to nature, to the nation, and to each other.
Yeah, I thought your discussion of tramps and your use of sources to talk about tramps and the way people perceive tramps in relation to evolving new practices was really compelling. So I wanted to ask you something a little more specific. I recently camped at a very classic loop campground, and I was reminded of your really compelling discussion of Emilio Meineke. And I was pretty captivated and fascinated by both him and his work. And I loved your illustrations that are in the book of his work, the maps and the way it shows the thinking about how to organize nature and facilitate camping and the discussions of what was appropriate or what was not. But it was kind of startled in a good way by his concept of guests of the nation and that notion of, what constitutes appropriate camping.
Yeah, so he's such an interesting figure, and we didn't include a picture of him in the book, but he definitely sort of embodies this, sort of old school, a student of the forest, right? He's a plant pathologist. He wants to save particularly the sequoia trees and the redwoods, and he gets called in by the national parks and the California state parks to figure out what's happening. Why are the sequoias deteriorating? And so the motivation for the Loop campground really came out of that, his training and his desire to preserve the natural material, right? These physical specimens. And he initially thought that campers were these just kind of menacing idiots, right? Running roughshod over the trees. And it's actually so interesting, the cover of the book, which is a WPA poster from the 1930s from Sequoia, actually shows precisely what Meineke was saying not to do, which is do not stake your tent to the roots of the trees, that was what was endangering them. And so he designs, as you say, this space that will minimize the damage from campers by these kind of loops, and to sort of segregate that space, not racially, I mean, but just to sort of segregate where campers live from the rest of the surroundings. And that's really his initial belief. But over the course of designing that, he starts to appreciate kind of what it is those visitors are after. What do they want in the woods? Why do they want to have a space that feels home-like? That they can kind of reproduce a little model of their household out in the woods. And that's where this philosophy kind of comes up with it, and that he, particularly in conversation with other folks like Bob Marshall, begin to think about why the federal government should, in fact, not just try to minimize their damage, but actually expand the infrastructure for campers, that it's a service the government should provide during particularly during the Great Depression. And so it becomes sort of taken up by New Dealers as this that idea of guests of the nation, that this is something that the government, should provide, and that citizens will appreciate what the government is doing for them. And that's absolutely what happened. This was sort of bureaucratic wildfire, and people began, or organizations, the national parks to the national forests, state parks, begin building these loop campgrounds hand over fist as fast as they can. And then campers come to populate them almost faster than they can create them. And I think, for my part, I think it seemed equal parts the actual design, right, itself as this kind of blueprint that could be reproduced in many different spaces, and the sort of philosophical architecture that came along with it, right? That it wasn't just an kind of recreational activity, but it was one that spoke to people's sense. I mean, Meineke also said, in addition to saying campers, are guests of the nation, that campers, feel enjoyment by establishing a kind of temporary site on what he said was 130 millionth part ownership. And that was the population at the time, 130 million. So that by camping, you were literally claiming a kind of, virtual or symbolic ownership of a piece of the nation. And I think, again, that kind of philosophy, the New Deal bureaucrats kind of just scoop that up and see this as an important thing to advance.
Last time I went camping, I think 130 million people were there. Maybe. It kind of seems like Meineke is operationalizing some of the ideas that you explain come from John Muir, but are not the ideas we necessarily associate with John Muir. And I thought I knew almost everything about John Muir, but I learned a ton about John Muir that I found surprising. And I think readers of this book will be especially surprised by some of your insights on him, which are convincingly made and compelling. You want to say a little bit about John Muir?
Sure. Yeah, it's this is one of the parts of the book that I felt probably the most nervous about, right? Having grown up as a Californian, John Muir is an icon. He is, right, the font of all things positive about nature and sort of advocating for the environment. So, and partly that's why I was really interested to see, well, what did John Muir think about camping, and how did he relate to the sort of early origins of this? And sort of what I found in looking at it was that in kind of his early travels, before he becomes that famous icon that we all know, is that he did, as you said before, had a love-hate relationship with sleeping outside. He loved nature. He wanted to see and touch and sort of be in as many of those spaces as he could, but particularly in his first really long outdoor trek in 1867, he's walking through the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. And it's so interesting to follow him, and as he sort of kept his diary through this, in alternately kind of reveling in tropical spaces or semi-tropical spaces, and then like really trying to avoid sleeping outside at all costs. He'd rather knock on the door of, suspicious strangers and ask if he could sleep on their floor in their hayloft than sleeping outside. And so I was trying to figure out what was going on with that. And I think he was too, in a sense. And that as he made his way from the South to California, he begins to work out what it is that makes nature feel more home-like and safe to sleep outdoors. And a lot of that had to do with kind of style of what style of being outdoors did he think was appropriate. And he does this in part by talking about the things he thinks are inappropriate. So he looks at, in the South, the recently freed enslaved people camping outside for necessity. And he's kind of, he disdains it. It seems sort of too primitive. For him, that they're living outdoors because they have to, rather than how he defines himself as kind of, sauntering through this land as a student. And the same happens in the High Sierras, where he sees indigenous people practicing interdependent lifeways, and he has a kind of begrudging admiration for their ability to do that, and even says, like, I should learn to boil lupin and saxifrage like the Indians do, but he didn't do that. He had a very ascetic style. It was legendary for, going out with a moldy hunk of cheese and half a loaf of bread and maybe a blanket. and just kind of observing and immersing himself in the wilderness in a way that he believed was more civilized. And so for him, that kind of leisured and scholarly take on nature and the outdoors was the one he begins to kind of proselytize, right, through his articles, his writings, the Sierra Club, and that begins to catch fire and very much as distancing from these other kind of more functional or interdependent ways of relating with the land that he saw modeled in different places of his travels.
Yeah, I couldn't believe those sections where you were talking about his concept of nesting and how he then judged people he encountered based on, were they nesting appropriately or camping appropriately? And your response just now gets to one of the things that I think is most impressive about your book and most important, which is the inclusivity of people who are often left out of recreational camping, literally, historically have been excluded, who have largely been left out of the history of camping and some of the history of outdoor recreation. And throughout the book, you talk about the dispossession of Native Americans and iconic places, but you also have a really consistent and very interesting conversation about African Americans trying to gain access to the public lands and to public nature. And I thought that was really compelling in that when your discussion of their efforts to be part of the Campers Republic. You want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, absolutely. And this, I think it's interesting both in the sense that by expanding what we call camping, it allows a lot of these more interesting connections to emerge, right? Rather than just sort of staying in the lane of what is recreational camping. But when it comes to that, I mean, absolutely, there, African Americans who in the 1930s were, pushing for greater access to this newly expanding landscape of camping, right? That Meineke and the federal government are sort of doubling down on, that they were finding themselves excluded, particularly in the southern parks, the national parks that, were new in the South in the 1930s, like Shenandoah. And so pushed a kind of to desegregate those spaces. But I think even beyond that kind of formal story of, and in which actually, did result in a early victory of integration in the early 1940s, but that also to think about the ways in which, beyond those kind of formal rules of the campaign of dissuasion before that of federal land managers kind of subtly dissuading African Americans by not marketing the parks to them directly as they were marketing them to many other Americans, as well as not sort of that sort of lack of overt welcome or aggressive attempts to market to them was not counteracting what had been a longstanding and very understandable sense that those spaces were not going to welcome them, that they were going to be and feel surveilled, that there was danger in the woods, full of white people as it was. And so kind of the efforts to try to think about what the kind of creation of this, for lack of a better word, mainstream form of recreational camping, who it was for, who was supposed to belong in that space, right? And the ways in which that could have created these clear, if kind of not entirely overt, boundaries, right, between and senses of exclusion between who felt like this was space that they could claim, right, that they could be part of that Campers Republic. And so, yeah, you see that come out early on, and then it sort of continues. And right, we see now, because of the lack of that work done early on, that sort of trying to diversify the audience and the participants in the outdoors is something we're still wrestling with.
I think some of your examples of just subtle dissuasion were really more disturbing than just the overt expected racism in the examples from the South, where it was kind of unsurprising that this was the treatment they received. But the patterns of dissuasion in the National Park Service and the public land, I thought that was really disturbing, but amazing the way you teased that out of the record.
Sorry to interrupt. I thought I was coming in, and then Andy, and I thought there was a pause, and Andy, you had a great point there at the end. Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Cox from Oxford University Press, and we are now to the Q&A portion from the audience of featuring some questions. I did have one question. You sort of started to touch on this, Phoebe, but about sort of the interaction of John Muir sort of watching the native people camping and things like that. As people were sort of moving out west and camping, was there interaction on the land, or were they sort of mimicking the native people? Were they taking over their land? Did you see any of that in your research? That
Sure. And there's a whole lot of historical research that is less focused on camping, but thinking about these sort of settler colonists in the same space as indigenous folks, and you see a whole that whole spectrum that you mentioned in terms of claiming space and dispossessing the native inhabitants there. I mean, that certainly was something the federal government was in the business of doing, of creating more spaces to either try to hold on to that agrarian dream for individuals to do, or for setting aside these reserves for recreation, for leisure in nature. So you absolutely see that. You certainly see, particularly later on, but as our colleague Phil Deloria writes, that the sort of long tradition of playing Indian certainly manifests itself in camping, even more so, I think, in organized camping. So scout camping, campfire girls, those kinds of things, which I don't really write about. I'm usually fond of saying I write about disorganized camping, which isn't quite right, but I don't so much write about kind of organized summer camps. But yes, absolutely, I think the adoption and appropriation of indigenous iconography and beliefs about kind of their style of camping that isn't so much what John Muir was seeing of kind of the interdependent and deep knowledge of these spaces, but just kind of the surface appearance of kind of going Indian for a few days. And so I definitely saw that in some of those, particularly late 19th or early 20th century camping promoters, who are sort of using that as a metaphor for why it's okay to kind of let yourself go wild for a couple of days.
Yeah, definitely. That sort of brings to the sort of idea of how did the 1960s sort of counterculture in the US, the UK, and other areas, how did that sort of change the way we look at camping or camping culture in that respect? How did that change?
Yeah, absolutely. And in this, I both relied a bunch on the work that Andy has done in this period, as well as I'm happy to let you chime in that. But in terms of what I have in the book is in part, I looked at the National Outdoor Leadership School, which was founded in 1965, as a kind of case study to think about that era, the 60s and 70s, and how camping changed and manifested in different ways during that time. So, I mean, what I see is kind of that era, and particularly that the sort of counterculture becomes a catalyst for a number of different trends. Certainly, its origins you see in terms of those, young people who went camping with their parents in the 1950s in these loop campgrounds that by then are filled with amenities, hot showers and swimming pools and things like that, and enjoyed those experiences outdoors. But as they began to get into their later teenage years and began to critique the kind of consumer capitalist mainstream world, wanted something else. They wanted to out of those loop campgrounds, and they begin to gravitate towards more backcountry recreation, being in the wilderness. This is the era on the heels of the passage of the Wilderness Act, 1964, and that are seeing this different mindset of finding themselves. Of discovering their true inner self, and that nature was a more authentic place to do so than urban environments or suburban environments particularly. And so it begins to grow the ranks of backpackers, Backpacking been around for a long time. John Muir was doing sort of something we might call backpacking, although he didn't carry a pack per se. But it, of course, had been around a long time. But what you see in the 60s and 70s are young people discovering it and popularizing it. And so you see magazines like Backpacker starts publishing in 1973 to cater to these growing ranks of that. And it also then drove a kind of infusing an environmental mindset, right? And this is the Earth Day era in the early 70s about how they could think about camping in ways that made less of an impact on the land. And that camping, particular kinds of camping, as an expression of their both political kind of belief as an environmentalist, but also their identity, right? As somebody who is literally trying to counter mainstream culture, and that they're doing this in a different way. And so it becomes backpacking, to say that you backpack rather than you car camp, becomes a marker of a certain kind of generational identity for a lot of people. And then it also inspires, and you can see in this some of the origins of the leave no trace idea as coming out of that particular moment, with all of its ironies and contradictions built in, of course.
One of the things I thought you did so well in this book is I loved your discussion of the 60s and 70s, and especially the discussion of the invention of a new kind of outdoor consumption, and why that was so important, not just to campers and outdoor people, but as a marker of changes in American politics and culture, and really kind of the rise of neoliberalism. But what I especially appreciated was the way you linked that all the way back to the beginning of the book to people like John Gould, who, it wasn't just Patagonia and REI that were inventing them, but there's a deeper history of outdoor consumption and fashion and these trends. And I think most people are aware. You really nicely brought that throughout the entire arc of your narrative.
Thanks. Yeah, but as you know, like that era, the 60s and 70s, it becomes, right, big business in all the definitions of that term. And it becomes really expressing yourself both as your identity as well as your attachment to camping through gear, right, through clothing, through gear, right? And it becomes this space of both, technological innovation, but also this working in on like, well, how can we do this in a way that is less impactful on the land, right? Don't build a fire, bring your camp stove, right? Or I guess more likely, don't. So campers used to very commonly cut down tree boughs to create a bed, like soft bedding. And so it was during this era and you see it at Knowles, where early on they're still doing that. But by the early 70s, they are advocating synthetic sleeping bags and sleeping pads. And that as a way of saving that space. But then, of course, they're using petroleum products to create those things. And so this sort of creates these new twists or wrinkles in that story of gear and consumption.
I have a question about, what do you think about glamping? That's taking it to the next level.
Well, I think glamping is definitely one of the ingredients in the resurgence of the popularity of camping, really since 2000. I think if you read, newspapers, articles from the late 1990s, and the visitor numbers in national parks and other places, it looks like a downward trend. Like people aren't camping anymore. People are definitely not backpacking anymore. Right. It was, and people attributed it to many different reasons: the rise of electronic media, video games, the next generation is, not willing to do the work, all of those kinds of things. But that there are multiple threads that begin to bring camping sort of back to being more popular. I mean, Great Recession is one of them, right? Becomes promoted as an affordable option. But then I think glamping and for millennials who are a large segment of campers these days, the ability to have kind of connectivity, both not just in the campground, but to plan out their travels by reserving spaces, having the sort of access, the sort of Instagram moments of camping, I think made it kind of newly popular among a new generation. And the glamping is part of that people who, don't own camping equipment or want to experience this, but in a less rustic way. We don't have to do quite as much work. Glamping is really appealing. And so that, when you look at the camping landscape now, there's just such a wide variety of the kinds of camping you can do, that it's just to say camping, we still have that iconic image of the tent camper, right, in a loop campground site, but that's just really one segment of a wider spectrum of how people, find this, umbrella kind of activity appealing. Are you a glamper?
I have been glamping.
Erin?
I have been glamping. I've also been, Susan and I were sort of talking about how we both had camped in the Outback in Australia. And so that was sort of my question about the native people. We camped out in the Outback, and then we had sort of an educational meeting with some of the indigenous people who live nearby, and they talked about their relationship to the land and us as campers, and our relationship to the land is obviously different. And so it was really educational and sort of wonderful in a way, to sort of spiritual from their perspective. And that was really interesting to me. Anyway, so I was sort of interested.
Yeah,
in that,
sounds really interesting.
But glamping, having a glass of wine and hanging out in a hammock isn't so bad, and sleeping in
not so bad.
heated tent. Yeah. We've been talking mostly about sort of American, camping and sort of the American iconic for the American. What am I trying to say? America and camping is what we've been talking about, and how iconic it is to sort of our nation's history and identity. But we're not the only place where people camp. So how does that, I know your focus is the US, but when you look at other countries, how does some of what you talk about here in the book sort of translate to other countries?
So yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'd love to talk to scholars in different areas who study that, and just to learn from them about that. And I'm very conscious that the story that I'm telling is an American story, and that it's the ways in which camping gets connected to these national narratives and beliefs is a unique version, right? That it doesn't play out in the same way everywhere else, which is not to say there's not lots of overlap, I think, in terms of the sort of attraction to recreational camping in the wake of sort of urban and industrial, right, changes in other places. There are, I know in Europe, there is a long tradition of camping, and in particular sort of van camping in their sort of annual, their summer vacation, right, that everybody kind of goes camping. It's a slightly different way. And so, my suspicion is that those traditions don't tap into the kind of founding social contract of those nations as much as it does in the US. I think the foundation of the U.S. as a settler colonial nation, right, and that sort of attachment to land, while not unique, I think the combination of the two is, and the sort of the tight bond that it forms is different, and that I think it would be interesting to contemplate places where a lot of people camp, but don't necessarily do so thinking they are guests of the nation, right? That there are other sort of motivations, traditions, ways of camping, even if, again, on the surface, the activity might look very similar, right? That the sort of materials that people use and what they're actually doing and how they express they like being outdoors, that it might tell different things about culture in those countries than it tells us about the US.
Yeah.
I had an opportunity to camp across Norway, and that seems to be the place that has sort of a similar system of camping being ingrained in both national culture and law. There is the law that you have to host people even on private land unless you have an explicit reason not to. So that was interesting.
And I think Canada actually has a similar law. I was speaking with somebody recently who mentioned something about that it may not be private land, but that essentially you have a right to camp on unoccupied public land, which is obviously different, right, for us in the US, but that was very much, the origin in the US it was never spelled out. It wasn't in law. It was a kind of tacit assumption that recreational campers could camp on public or private land. They just asked for, you might ask for permission, but that you could if you were doing recreational camping, you could kind of assume that you could do that. But that as these sort of more formalized spaces for camping became more common, right, the loop campground, et cetera, that those other forms of kind of informal camping became more restricted, right? And that includes those for, the unsheltered. And so we no longer have this assumption that you have a right to camp somewhere. In fact, explicitly, many public places you are forbidden to do so. So that is definitely a difference in the US and at least Canada and Norway that we know.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I'm from Austin, Texas, and I'm not sure exactly. I live in New York now, so I'm not exactly sure when they passed the law, but they did pass the law where people could camp anywhere. And then all of these campsites, and it was many people who didn't have other homes. And so they were camping everywhere. And then it became such a problem where it was also during the pandemic. So there wasn't, they were concerned about sort of, safety as well as sort of health and things like that. And do you see this if I think Portland has sort of a similar experience, Portland, Oregon has a sort of a similar experience. Do you think that if we sort of lift some restrictions that will change the way we look at camping sort of recreationally? Or how do you think that changes, I guess, our connection to camping if people are, or does it? Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can sort of predict that. I mean, this is right. It's the occupational hazard of being a historian. You study the past and then everybody asks you about the future. What I do think is really interesting is to sort of watch what happens to some of these experiments, particularly some that have happened during COVID, right? Of not just allowing greater license to camp in urban or suburban spaces, but that the cities are experimenting with these safe sleeping villages, right? Of actually providing municipal services to tent dwellers and in unsheltered encampments. And so just to see, I mean, these were things that have been proposed for a long time, but most cities were unwilling to try them until the pandemic. And then it became kind of a matter of necessity. And so to watch in places like San Francisco, where they've been doing this, to sort of see what happens. Does this become a useful solution for a lot of people? And not just in terms of helping individuals, which I think that's pretty clear, that having meals and hot showers and trash pickup can really make these spaces more safe and livable. But that whether it changes how people think about the problem of the unsheltered, because I think partly what we see, at least I certainly see this in Boulder, is that some of the reaction is while even among people who are advocates, right, and want to support and help unsheltered individuals, that they see that camping in natural or outdoor spaces as the problem, right? That it's a misuse of space, and that their functional camping is preventing residents from their kind of higher right to recreate in those spaces, right? And so that there's this kind of contest between that, and that the camping itself becomes as much the issue, even though in many ways it's the symptom, right, of a much larger social and economic problem. And so in that sense, I think it will be interesting to see what happens following this moment around that kind of a dialogue.
Yeah, definitely. We have a good question from Facebook that we want to share. Is there any relation between camping and romanticism? Can we consider it as an unintentional tendency towards romanticism?
Sure. I think it depends on the person. But in the sense of, kind of a romantic attachment to an idea of nature, right? Of that nature is a space for discovering your authentic self. I think it relates to the sort of countercultural vision of this, and you certainly have seeds of it in John Muir. And you could make a through line of that we might call romanticism, that it provides a platform that allows people to feel themselves as if they are getting back to nature, right? That they are sort of getting out of the city, they're escaping and being in this wholly different space right? Whereas if you step back a little and analyze it, you can see, well, they're bringing their consumer worlds with them. Are they really getting away from it all, right? But certainly that's a feeling that many people have. And so I think romantic is as good a label for it as any.
That's good. Do you have any historic advice for countries where camping isn't a tradition but would like to introduce it? How do you start camping?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the latest things that I've seen are about trying to provide people with, low costs of entry, right? Camping is often suggested as a low cost vacation, but camping gear is not cheap, even at kind of the non high end category, and that sort of it requires an initial upfront investment in a bunch of gear. And so having gear lending libraries, we can borrow it, or like New York City has a program that provides everything. You can sign up to camp in Central Park or in Prospect Park in Brooklyn. At least they did before the pandemic. I don't know what the status of that program is, but you sign up and you came and they'd provide whatever you need. And the camp would be there. It wasn't quite glamping, but it was a page from the same book in the sense of like, you've never been camping before? Come try it out. We'll tell you how to do it, and you don't have to buy anything first. And so in that sense of having not just that sort of basic level infrastructure, but allowing people to try it out without making that sort of initial investment, I think have been some successful programs in allowing people to sort of experiment with, is this something we might want to try on our own? Do we like this, or do we want to try something else?
It's even REI is renting gear now.
Really?
So, I think they've rented for a long time, I think. Yeah. So that's another way of, sort of REI and other co-op, local co-ops of, either just lending or low cost rentals is, absolutely. My son's going to go backpacking in August, and that's where we're going. We're going to go rent him a frame backpack rather than buying one. So
yeah, do it. All right. One last question from the audience. Did camping increase love for the mother country in any sense, particularly if we're talking in a colonial context?
So, I mean, it depends on kind of when you date colonial context, because it's hard to read back to the U.S., or the pre-U.S. colonies, and in the ways in which camping is hard to distinguish from, squatting on land or early, attempts at building a sod house or, any of those kinds of things. It's not a specific kind of activity that way. But I certainly think that by the New Deal era, by the 1930s, that the sort of promotion of it as a patriotic act, and particularly in national parks, which of course had been promoted for a long time even by then, right, as spaces to experience America, right, to see America first, to be connected to those spectacular landscapes that are uniquely American, and that camping became kind of seen as the ideal vehicle in order to do that for many people. So I absolutely think that there is a connection there, but it's a more modern one after we get to that moment of leisure, right, of mixing your leisure with the land, and is less about the kind of labor part of it, although camping takes a fair amount of work even today.
Oh yeah, even with the pop-up tents, it's still, you have to do a lot of work.
Yeah, especially if you're dragging little kids along with you.
Oh my goodness. Well, we're about out of time, so I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to do you have one last thought that you want to leave the audience with?
Oh, my thought would be get this book and take it camping. Read it's insightful, but it's just super entertaining. It's really a beautiful book and a beautifully written book.
Oh, thanks so much, Andy. And I guess my final thought will be, I'm so pleased to have finished this book and have so many people be interested in it. And that I also think it's really, I sit on the shoulders of so many other scholars who have been working in this area, whether it's sort of the connection of nature and culture, environmental history, right? The work that Andy, you've done, others that have done in these related spaces, that really what I did was, wouldn't be possible without a much broader bookshelf of these kinds of stories. And so hopefully, those footnotes, hopefully are not just for scholars only, but if you're interested in a topic, flip to the footnote and see all of the other interesting work that made it possible to sort of tell this story.
That's great. Well, and we're going into the weekend of our American independence. And so we're thinking about American things. This is a great time to go camping and read this book. So thank you both very much. And thank you to everybody who has been watching wherever you are. I just want to highlight our next book club event, which is August 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Gordon Campbell and Jeffrey Plank will be discussing Campbell's Norse America. So we'd be excited to have everybody back. Here is our website in case you want to check anything out. And thanks again, Andy and Phoebe. This was really great conversation, and I hope everybody goes out and buys the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right.